Behind the towering gates of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal tradition echo through stone corridors, a young prince is learning lessons that no textbook could ever teach. While other children his age worry about homework and playground friendships, Prince George is discovering what it truly means to carry the weight of a crown that hasn't even touched his head yet. This isn't just another story about royal privilege or palace life. This is about a boy who must grow into a king, guided by the very men and women whose lives are dedicated to protecting not just his body, but the future of an entire nation. The Royal Guard doesn't just stand at attention during ceremonies. They are the silent architects shaping the character of Britain's future monarch, one carefully planned lesson at a time. What happens when duty meets childhood? When ancient traditions collide with modern realities, and when the people sworn to protect you become your most important teachers. The answers lie within these walls, where every conversation carries the weight of history, and every decision could shape the future of the monarchy itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside Commander James Mitchell of the Royal Guard. The boy's footsteps echoed against the ancient stones, each one carrying him deeper into a world that existed far beyond the reach of ordinary childhood experiences. His school uniform had been replaced with more practical clothing, and his usual carefree demeanor showed hints of the serious young man he was slowly becoming. Commander Mitchell had served the royal family for over 2 decades, but training the future king presented challenges unlike any he had faced before. George wasn't just any child. He was a boy who would one day rule over millions of people, make decisions that could affect entire nations, and carry the weight of centuries of tradition on his shoulders. The commander understood that his role went far beyond simple protection. He was helping to mold the character of Britain's future monarch. The training sessions had begun quietly, almost secretly, 6 months earlier. While the public knew that Prince George received the finest education money could provide, few understood the additional layer of instruction that took place within the castle walls. These weren't lessons about mathematics or literature. These were lessons about leadership, responsibility, and the true meaning of service to one's people. On this particular morning, George found himself in the castle's war room, a space that had witnessed countless historical moments. Maps covered the walls, and the large oak table in the center bore the scars of important decisions made over generations. Commander Mitchell gestured for the young prince to take a seat, not at the head of the table as protocol might suggest, but in a simple chair along the side. The lesson began with a question that seemed almost too simple. "Your Highness, what do you think it means to be a king?" George shifted in his chair, considering the question carefully. He had been asked similar questions before, but something about the commander's tone suggested this wasn't a test he could pass with rehearsed answers. "To rule over people?" George ventured, his voice carrying the uncertainty of youth. Commander Mitchell nodded thoughtfully but pressed further. "And how does one rule wisely?" This question proved more difficult. George thought about the kings he had studied in history lessons. Some were remembered as great leaders, others as tyrants. The difference between them wasn't always clear in textbooks, but sitting in this room where real decisions had been made, the weight of the question felt different.
Over the following weeks, George's education took on new dimensions.
Commander Mitchell introduced him to various members of the Royal Guard, each with their own specialties and perspectives. Sergeant Sarah Collins, who had served in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Guard, taught George about the sacrifices made by those who served their country. Her stories weren't glamorous tales of adventure. They were honest accounts of duty, fear, and the responsibility that comes with protecting others. Through these interactions, George began to understand that being a king wasn't about wearing crowns or living in palaces. It was about understanding the people he would one day serve and recognizing that true leadership meant putting others' needs before his own comfort. The physical aspects of training were equally important. While George wouldn't be expected to engage in combat as a modern monarch, Commander Mitchell believed that understanding physical discipline and personal protection was crucial. The training sessions took place in a converted stable that had been transformed into a private gymnasium. Here, George learned basic self-defense techniques, not because he would need to fight his own battles, but because understanding vulnerability helped develop empathy for those who couldn't protect themselves. These sessions revealed something remarkable about the young prince. Despite his privileged upbringing, George approached each challenge with genuine determination. When he struggled with a particular technique, he didn't expect special treatment or easier alternatives. Instead, he asked questions, practiced repeatedly, and showed the kind of persistence that impressed even the most experienced guards.
One afternoon, during a particularly challenging training session, George found himself paired with Officer David Thompson, a younger guard who had joined the Royal Protection Unit only 2 years earlier. Officer Thompson had initially been nervous about training with the future king, but he quickly discovered that George was genuinely interested in learning from everyone around him, regardless of their rank or experience. Their conversation that day revealed George's growing understanding of his future role. "Officer Thompson," George asked during a break, "do you ever worry about making the wrong decision?" Here was a 10-year-old boy asking about the very fears that kept experienced professionals awake at night. Thompson considered his answer carefully, understanding that his words might influence the future king's perspective.
"Every day, Your Highness," Thompson replied honestly. "But I've learned that fear of making mistakes shouldn't prevent us from making decisions at all. The key is to gather as much information as possible, consult with wise advisors, and then have the courage to act." George absorbed this wisdom, adding it to the growing collection of insights he was gathering from his time with the Royal Guard. Each interaction was teaching him that leadership wasn't a solo performance. It required building relationships, understanding different perspectives, and knowing when to listen rather than speak. The psychological aspects of training were perhaps the most crucial, though they were woven so seamlessly into daily activities that George barely noticed them. Commander Mitchell had studied the boy's personality carefully, identifying both strengths and areas that needed development. George showed natural empathy and genuine concern for others, but he sometimes struggled with the confidence needed for leadership positions. To address this, the commander created scenarios where George had to make decisions and then live with the consequences. These weren't life or death situations, but they were meaningful enough to teach important lessons. During one exercise, George was asked to organize a small charitable event for castle staff. He had to coordinate with multiple departments, manage a budget, and ensure that everyone involved felt valued and appreciated. The project challenged George in ways that traditional schoolwork never could. He had to negotiate with the kitchen staff about menu options, work with maintenance crews to set up the venue, and coordinate with security to ensure the event ran smoothly. When conflicts arose, and they did, George had to find solutions that satisfied everyone involved while staying within his budget constraints. The event itself was a modest success, but the real victory was in George's growth throughout the planning process. He learned that leadership often meant making unpopular decisions, that compromise was sometimes necessary, and that taking responsibility for outcomes, both good and bad, was a crucial part of earning respect from those he would one day lead. Commander Mitchell observed these developments with quiet satisfaction. The boy was learning lessons that couldn't be taught through lectures or textbooks. He was developing the kind of character that would serve him well when he eventually inherited the throne. As autumn approached, George's training intensified. The sessions now included discussions about history, not just British history, but global events that had shaped modern leadership. They studied leaders from different cultures and time periods, examining what made some successful while others failed. These weren't academic exercises. They were practical lessons in understanding human nature and the complexities of governing diverse populations. One particularly memorable session focused on Queen Elizabeth II's early years as monarch. Commander Mitchell shared stories that weren't found in official biographies, accounts of difficult decisions, personal sacrifices, and moments of doubt that even the most experienced ruler faced. George listened intently, beginning to understand that being a monarch meant accepting a lifetime of service that would often require personal sacrifice. The relationships George was building with the Royal Guard extended beyond formal training sessions. During breaks between lessons, he would often seek out different guards to hear their stories and perspectives. He learned about their backgrounds, their families, and their motivations for choosing careers in service to the crown. These conversations were shaping his understanding of the people who dedicated their lives to protecting and serving the monarchy. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who specialized in dignitary protection, became one of George's favorite conversation partners. Her family had immigrated to Britain when she was young, and her path to the Royal Guard had been filled with challenges that George found both inspiring and educational. Through her stories, he began to understand the diverse backgrounds of the people who served the crown, and the importance of ensuring that all citizens felt valued and protected regardless of their origins. The training was also teaching George about the broader responsibilities that came with his future role. He learned about the Commonwealth nations, the constitutional monarchy system, and the delicate balance between tradition and modern governance. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were practical realities that would shape every decision he would make as king. By winter, George had developed a different relationship with his royal identity. The training had shown him that being a prince wasn't about privilege. It was about preparation. Every lesson, every interaction, and every challenge was designed to prepare him for a role that would demand the best of his character, intelligence, and dedication. The young prince, who had begun training 6 months earlier as a somewhat uncertain boy, was growing into someone who understood the weight of his future responsibilities. But more importantly, he was developing the relationships and perspectives that would help him carry that weight with wisdom, compassion, and strength. Winter brought new challenges and deeper lessons for Prince George, as his training with the Royal Guard evolved into more complex scenarios. The comfortable routines of autumn gave way to situations that tested not just his knowledge, but his character under pressure. Commander Mitchell had carefully designed this phase to push the young prince beyond his comfort zone, while ensuring he remained grounded in the values that would define his future reign. The training facility had been expanded to include a communications center where George learned about crisis management and decision-making under time pressure. The room buzzed with activity as various scenarios played out on multiple screens, each one designed to teach different aspects of leadership during challenging times. George sat at a control desk, wearing a headset that connected him to different advisors who were actually Royal Guard members playing various roles. The first major test came during a simulated natural disaster scenario. George found himself managing the response to a fictional earthquake that had struck a major British city. Phone calls came in from different departments, each presenting urgent needs that seemed to compete for limited resources. The young prince had to decide whether to prioritize rescue operations, medical aid, or infrastructure repair, knowing that his choices would affect thousands of people. Initially, George struggled with the complexity and pace of the decisions required. He wanted to help everyone immediately, but Commander Mitchell had designed the scenario to mirror real-world constraints where perfect solutions rarely existed. As the simulation progressed, George learned to ask better questions, seek additional information when time permitted, and make difficult choices based on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. After each simulation, extensive debriefing sessions helped George understand not just what decisions he had made, but why he had made them. These discussions often revealed unconscious biases or assumptions that needed to be addressed. Commander Mitchell and his team never criticized harshly, but they asked probing questions that forced George to examine his decision-making process critically. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes joined the training team during this phase, bringing her expertise in international relations and diplomacy. Her background included service in various overseas missions and extensive experience in cross-cultural communication. She introduced George to the complexities of modern monarchy in a global context, where every public statement and action could have far-reaching diplomatic consequences. The lessons with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes often took place in the castle's library, surrounded by centuries of diplomatic correspondence and international treaties. George learned about the delicate balance required when representing Britain's interests while maintaining relationships with diverse international partners. These weren't theoretical discussions. They were practical preparations for a role that would require him to navigate complex global relationships throughout his reign. One particularly challenging session involved a mock diplomatic crisis between Britain and a fictional allied nation. George had to balance maintaining the alliance while addressing legitimate concerns raised by the other country's leadership. The scenario required him to understand multiple perspectives simultaneously, communicate clearly without making commitments beyond his authority, and find creative solutions that preserved relationships while protecting British interests. During these diplomatic exercises, George began to appreciate the importance of cultural sensitivity and the need to understand different worldviews. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes shared stories from her own diplomatic experiences, illustrating how misunderstandings could escalate into serious conflicts and how careful communication could resolve seemingly impossible situations. The physical training component also intensified during this period. While George wouldn't be expected to engage in combat as a modern monarch, Commander Mitchell believed that understanding personal vulnerability and the realities of protection protocols was essential. The training sessions now included more advanced self-defense techniques and situational awareness exercises. Officer Sarah Williams, who specialized in threat assessment, led many of these sessions. Her approach combined physical training with psychological preparation, helping George understand how to remain calm and decisive even when feeling scared or overwhelmed. These skills would prove valuable not just for personal safety, but for maintaining composure during any crisis he might face as king. One memorable training exercise involved George navigating through a crowded marketplace while maintaining awareness of potential threats and protecting a dignitary, actually a training dummy, assigned to his care. The scenario required him to balance accessibility with security, ensuring that he could connect with people while remaining safe. The exercise was both physically challenging and mentally exhausting, but it taught George important lessons about the constant vigilance required from those who protect public figures. The relationship between George and the Royal Guard members continued to deepen during this phase. He began to understand not just their professional duties, but their personal motivations and sacrifices. Sergeant Michael Chen, who had joined the Royal Guard after serving in the Royal Navy, often shared stories about the transition from military service to civilian protection duties. These conversations helped George understand the different pathways that led people to serve the Crown, and the various skills and perspectives they brought to their roles. He learned that effective leadership meant recognizing and utilizing the diverse talents of team members, rather than trying to make all decisions independently. The psychological aspects of training became more sophisticated as George matured.
Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, a psychologist who specialized in leadership development, joined the training team to help George understand the mental and emotional challenges that would come with his future role.
Her sessions didn't feel like therapy. They were practical discussions about managing stress, making decisions with incomplete information, and maintaining personal relationships while serving in a public role. Dr. Whitfield introduced George to concepts like emotional intelligence, explaining how understanding his own emotions and those of others would be crucial for effective leadership. They practiced scenarios where George had to deliver difficult news, comfort people during crises, and maintain composure while facing criticism or opposition.
One particularly valuable lesson involved learning to separate personal feelings from professional duties. George participated in role-playing exercises where he had to make decisions that might be personally difficult but necessary for the greater good.
These scenarios helped him understand that being a monarch would sometimes require putting the needs of the nation ahead of personal preferences or relationships. The training also began to include more direct exposure to real royal duties, though in carefully controlled environments. George started accompanying senior royals on certain public engagements, observing how they interacted with different audiences and handled unexpected situations. These experiences were debriefed extensively, with Commander Mitchell and his team helping George analyze what he had observed and learned. During one such engagement at a children's hospital, George witnessed how small gestures of attention and kindness could have profound impacts on people facing difficult circumstances. He saw how his presence alone could bring comfort and hope to families dealing with serious illnesses. The experience was both humbling and inspiring, helping him understand the unique power that came with his position and the responsibility to use that power thoughtfully. The technological aspects of modern monarchy also became part of George's education during this phase. Communications specialist Jennifer Park taught him about digital security, social media management, and the rapid pace of modern information exchange. George learned how a single statement or photograph could reach millions of people within minutes, and how important it was to think carefully before any public communication. These lessons included practical exercises where George had to craft responses to various scenarios that might arise on social media or in digital communications. He learned about the difference between personal opinions and official statements, and how to communicate complex ideas in ways that different audiences could understand and appreciate. The winter months also brought exposure to the economic aspects of his future role. Financial advisor Robert Sterling, who had previously worked with the Treasury, introduced George to basic concepts about government budgets, economic policy, and the monarchy's financial responsibilities. These weren't advanced economics lessons, but rather foundational understanding about how financial decisions affected ordinary citizens and the nation's well-being.
George learned about the cost of royal operations and the importance of demonstrating value to taxpayers who funded the monarchy. He began to understand that every decision about royal spending would be scrutinized, and that demonstrating responsible stewardship of public resources would be crucial for maintaining public support. As spring approached, George's confidence and competence had grown significantly. The uncertain boy who had started training was developing into a young man who could think critically under pressure, communicate effectively with diverse audiences, and understand complex situations from multiple perspectives. But perhaps most importantly, he was learning to value the advice and expertise of others while taking responsibility for final decisions. The relationships he had built with Royal Guard members had evolved from formal training partnerships into something resembling mentorship. Commander Mitchell observed with satisfaction that George was beginning to demonstrate the kind of leadership qualities that would serve him well throughout his future reign. The young prince was learning to listen carefully, ask thoughtful questions, and make decisions based on careful consideration of available information. The second phase of training had successfully challenged George to grow beyond his initial capabilities while maintaining the core values that would define his character as a leader. He was ready for the next level of preparation, though neither he nor his trainers fully understood how demanding and transformative the final phase would prove to be.
The final phase of Prince George's training began with an unprecedented level of realism that would test everything he had learned over the previous year. Commander Mitchell had designed this concluding period to simulate the actual pressures and responsibilities that George would face as king while still maintaining the safety and guidance appropriate for his age.
The transformation from protected prince to prepared future monarch would require pushing boundaries in ways that would challenge both student and instructors. The spring morning when this phase commenced looked deceptively ordinary. George arrived at the castle's newly established Situation Room, a sophisticated facility that had been constructed specifically for advanced leadership training. Multiple screens displayed real-time information from around Britain and the Commonwealth, while communication systems connected to various government departments created an environment that closely resembled the actual nerve centers where crucial decisions were made.
Commander Mitchell explained that the next 3 months would involve George taking responsibility for managing simulated crises that were based on real events from British history and current global challenges. Unlike previous exercises where mistakes led to discussion and correction, these scenarios would unfold over days or weeks, with George's decisions creating consequences that would affect the entire simulation and require sustained problem-solving.
The first major challenge involved a complex constitutional crisis that tested George's understanding of the delicate balance between royal authority and democratic governance. The scenario presented a situation where Parliament was deadlocked on a crucial issue affecting national security, with different political parties unable to reach compromise. As the constitutional monarch, George had to navigate between respecting democratic processes while ensuring that government continued to function effectively. The simulation required George to meet with representatives from different political parties, each played by Royal Guard members who had studied the actual positions and personalities involved. These weren't simple conversations. They were intense negotiations where George had to listen carefully to competing viewpoints, identify areas of potential compromise, and find ways to encourage resolution without overstepping constitutional boundaries. What made this exercise particularly challenging was that George wasn't simply making decisions in isolation. His choices affected how other participants responded, creating a dynamic situation where early decisions influenced later options. If he pushed too hard for a particular solution, some parties might become more entrenched in opposition. If he remained too neutral, the deadlock might continue indefinitely while important national issues remained unresolved. As the constitutional crisis simulation progressed over 2 weeks, George experienced the exhausting reality of sustained leadership pressure. He found himself waking up each morning knowing that new developments would require his attention and decision-making. Sleep became difficult as he worried about whether his choices were wise and whether he was adequately considering all the people who would be affected by the outcomes. Dr.
Whitfield provided crucial support during this period, helping George understand that the stress he was feeling was normal and even beneficial for his development. She explained that future kings needed to learn how to manage sustained pressure while maintaining their judgment and compassion.
The goal wasn't to eliminate stress but to function effectively despite it. Major Catherine Holmes joined the training team during this phase, bringing her expertise in international security and intelligence assessment. Her role involved teaching George how to evaluate threat assessments, understand intelligence reports, and make decisions based on incomplete or uncertain information. These skills would be crucial for a monarch who would receive security briefings and might need to make decisions that could affect national safety. The intelligence training took place in a secure facility within the castle where George learned to analyze reports from multiple sources, identify patterns that might indicate emerging threats, and understand the difference between genuine security concerns and political rhetoric. Major Holmes emphasized that monarchs needed to maintain enough independence from government agencies to provide objective oversight while respecting the expertise of security professionals. One particularly challenging exercise involved George reviewing intelligence about a potential terrorist threat that might or might not be credible. He had to decide whether to recommend heightened security measures that would disrupt normal life for millions of people, or to maintain current protocols while risking potential harm if the threat proved real. The scenario forced him to balance public safety against personal freedom, a challenge that modern leaders face regularly. The economic dimensions of royal responsibility became more prominent during this phase as well.
Treasury specialist Amanda Chen worked with George on understanding how royal decisions could affect national finances and public confidence in government institutions. These lessons went beyond simple budget management to include understanding how royal actions could influence international investment, tourism, and Britain's overall economic reputation. George participated in simulated meetings with international business leaders, where his statements and demeanor could potentially affect major investment decisions. He learned that modern monarchs couldn't separate personal behavior from economic consequences, and that maintaining dignity and competence in public settings was actually a form of economic policy.
The social media and communications challenges also intensified during this final phase. Digital communications director James Park created scenarios where George had to respond to rapidly developing stories that required immediate royal comment. These exercises taught him that in the modern era, failing to respond quickly could be as damaging as responding inappropriately. One memorable exercise involved George managing communications during a simulated natural disaster where traditional media, social media, and official government channels were all providing different information to the public. He had to coordinate with various agencies to ensure accurate information was shared while providing reassurance and leadership during a crisis that was causing panic among the affected population. The physical protection aspects of training also reached new levels of sophistication. George participated in full-scale evacuation exercises where he experienced what it would feel like to be moved quickly from one secure location to another while maintaining composure and continuing to fulfill royal duties. These scenarios were designed to prepare him for the reality that being monarch would sometimes require personal sacrifice for national security. Sergeant Williams led exercises where George learned to function normally while wearing discreet protective equipment and staying within sight of protection officers. He practiced maintaining natural conversations and interactions while being constantly aware of security protocols. These skills would be essential for a monarch who needed to be accessible to the public while remaining safe. As the training progressed, George began to understand that being an effective monarch required developing what Commander Mitchell called adaptive leadership, the ability to adjust his approach based on circumstances while maintaining core principles. This meant being formal when situations required dignity, but also being approachable when people needed comfort or reassurance. The relationships George had built with individual Royal Guard members proved crucial during this demanding phase. When simulations became particularly stressful or when he felt overwhelmed by the complexity of decisions required, conversations with his training partners helped provide perspective and emotional support. These relationships had evolved beyond simple instruction into genuine mentorship and mutual respect. Officer Thompson, who had been one of George's earliest training partners, often provided informal debriefing sessions after particularly challenging exercises. Their conversations helped George process difficult emotions and maintain confidence in his developing abilities. Thompson's honesty about his own struggles with responsibility and decision-making helped George understand that uncertainty and self-doubt were normal parts of leadership rather than signs of inadequacy. The religious and ceremonial aspects of monarchy also received increased attention during this final phase. Chaplain Robert Davies worked with George on understanding the spiritual dimensions of royal service, including the religious ceremonies that would mark important moments in his reign. These weren't just lessons about ritual and tradition, they were discussions about the deeper meaning of service and the personal sacrifices that royal duty would require. George learned about the coronation ceremony and its significance, not just as a celebration but as a public commitment to serve the British people throughout his life. Chaplain Davies helped him understand that the religious elements of monarchy weren't merely traditional. They represented a spiritual foundation for the enormous responsibilities he would carry. As summer approached, the final evaluations of George's training began. Rather than traditional tests, these assessments involved comprehensive scenarios that required George to demonstrate all the skills and knowledge he had acquired over the previous year. Commander Mitchell and his team observed how George handled multiple simultaneous challenges, how he communicated with different audiences, and how he made decisions under pressure. The culminating exercise was a week-long simulation that combined elements from all previous training phases. George faced a complex international crisis that required diplomatic communication with foreign leaders, coordination with government officials, management of public communications, and personal decision-making about royal family priorities. The scenario unfolded in real time, with George required to maintain normal daily activities while managing an evolving crisis. By the end of this final exercise, both George and his instructors could see the remarkable transformation that had occurred. The uncertain boy who had begun training had developed into a young man capable of complex thinking, empathetic communication, and responsible decision-making. More importantly, he had developed the relationships and support systems that would help him continue growing as he matured into his royal role. Commander Mitchell reflected on the success of the training program during the final debriefing sessions. George had exceeded expectations not just in terms of knowledge and skills acquired, but in the maturity and wisdom he demonstrated when facing difficult challenges. The young prince had learned to value the expertise of others while taking responsibility for his own decisions, to balance competing interests while maintaining core principles, and to communicate effectively with diverse audiences while remaining authentic to his own character. The training had also revealed George's natural strengths, including his genuine empathy for others, his intellectual curiosity, and his commitment to serving responsibly.
These qualities, combined with the practical skills and knowledge he had acquired, provided a strong foundation for his future development as a leader.
As the formal training program concluded, George understood that his education as a future monarch would continue throughout his life. The relationships he had built with the royal guard would evolve but continue, providing ongoing support and guidance as he faced new challenges. The foundation established during this intensive year of preparation would support decades of service to come. The young prince who emerged from this comprehensive training was ready to begin the next phase of his preparation for kingship, equipped with practical skills, emotional resilience, and most importantly, a deep understanding of the responsibility and privilege that would define his life's work.